It started on a night so ordinary that no one on Wycliffe Street could have predicted how violently it would be shattered. A Tuesday, cool winds drifting through the trees, porch lights glowing like faint fireflies, families settling into the soft quiet that only a peaceful neighborhood can produce. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. And yet, for reasons no one could understand at the time, every dog on the street seemed restless long before the sun dipped below the rooftops. Some residents said their pets refused to eat dinner. Others mentioned how their dogs kept staring at the eastern end of the street, toward the old house at 46B, the one that hadn't had a proper owner in years. A few pets paced back and forth, whining at doors and scratching at floors like something invisible was pulling them toward or pushing them away from that darkened lot. But people ignored it. Animals had their moods, after all. They brushed it off, laughed about it even, completely unaware that the first warning signs were already sounding. Around 11:42 p.m., as the neighborhood slept, a low, drawn-out howl cut through the silence like a crack splitting open the night. One dog. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the entire street erupted into the kind of synchronized, frantic howling that felt almost orchestrated, like the animals were crying out in warning, begging someone, anyone, to listen. Curtains fluttered open. Lights flicked on. Parents whispered in confused irritation, children woke frightened, and the sound only grew louder, more desperate. At first, people thought maybe a wild animal had wandered too close. A coyote, perhaps. But no, it wasn't fear that filled those howls. It was something else. Something frantic, primal, and deeply unsettled. Some described it as dogs sensing an earthquake. Others said it felt like they were protesting something. Or someone. Down the street, Mr. Langley stepped onto his porch, his old Labrador trembling uncontrollably at his feet. The dog's eyes were fixed firmly on the end of the road. When Mr. Langley followed that gaze, he saw it too, a pair of headlights slowly turning into the driveway of 46B. The house that had sat empty for years now had a visitor in the dead of night. A moving truck, small and old, its paint peeling and engine whining, rumbled into the overgrown driveway. The dogs howled even louder, as if the arrival of that vehicle confirmed every instinct screaming inside them. People watched through half-open blinds, unsure if they should call someone or simply observe. After all, new neighbors weren't unusual. But arriving past midnight? Into that house. The truck door opened. A figure stepped out, tall, wrapped in a long dark coat despite the mild weather. Their face stayed hidden in shadow. No greeting, no wave, no glance around. Just a slow, deliberate walk toward the front door of 46B. The dogs lost their minds. Inside the house, a faint light flickered. It was the first time in a decade that anything had illuminated those dusty windows. And something about that small glow felt wrong. As if the house itself was waking from a long, troubled sleep. A few neighbors considered approaching, maybe offering a welcome, maybe asking why the dogs were reacting so violently. But something about the stranger's arrival froze everyone in place. Even the bravest residents later admitted they felt an unexplainable chill. The kind that crawls down your spine and settles like a stone in your stomach. By 12:30 a.m., the howling suddenly stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. As if a switch had been flipped. Total silence fell over Wycliffe Street. Too quickly. Too unnaturally. Some residents said that silence was even more terrifying than the howls. Children cried, sensing the tension. Adults whispered about the stranger. Dogs, exhausted, collapsed into uneasy sleep. And at the very edge of the street, where few dared to look for long, the front door of 46B slowly creaked shut behind the mysterious new tenant. The next morning, no one could agree on what they had actually seen. Had the figure limped? Were they carrying something heavy? Had the truck really arrived at 11:42 p.m., or did it only feel that late because the night itself seemed stretched out and distorted? All anyone truly agreed on was this: the night a stranger moved into 46B, every dog on Wycliffe Street howled as if warning the world of what was coming. Something had arrived. Something that didn't belong. And in the days to follow, the residents would learn that this night, the night of the howling, was only the beginning of a story their quiet street would never forget. Before the howling, before the stranger, before the fear slowly seeped beneath every doorstep, Wycliffe Street existed in a kind of peaceful routine that people often take for granted. The sort of rhythm that makes life predictable and deceptively safe. Mornings began with sprinklers clicking across trimmed lawns, the soft hum of coffee machines, and neighbors waving half-awake greetings as they backed out of their driveways. Afternoons were filled with distant laughter of children biking up and down the road, dogs sunbathing lazily on porches, and retired couples tending their gardens like it was a gentle form of meditation. It wasn't perfect, but it was familiar. Safe. Ordinary. People knew each other here, or at least believed they did. Mrs. Halpern, for example, had lived on the street for 32 years and prided herself on noticing even the smallest deviations in her environment. She could tell you which house forgot to bring in their trash cans or which teenager was trying to sneak home past curfew. Across from her lived the Ramos family, parents juggling work and parenthood, their daughter Lily always drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. Next door, the Keens, a young couple who had moved in just last spring, spent their weekends repainting old furniture or hosting small cookouts. Every house had its own quiet story, its own small frustrations, its own comfort zones. And together those lives formed the quiet pulse of the neighborhood. But beneath the surface of this predictable calm lay a fragile truth: people assumed that danger was something that happened elsewhere. Bad news belonged to other cities, other streets, other families. Here, the loudest disruptions came from the mailman honking at a dog blocking the driveway, or children arguing over whose turn it was to ride the red bicycle. Routine gave them the illusion that nothing could ever truly disturb Wycliffe Street. Even the dogs played into this rhythm. In daylight, they barked at squirrels, lounged in the sun, or obediently followed their owners on evening walks. They were part of the neighborhood's charm, its living, breathing indicators of normalcy. And those dogs almost never acted strangely. That was why, when they did, people noticed. But in the days before the stranger moved in, life marched forward as it always had. The neighborhood group chat discussed mundane things. Someone spotted a new food truck downtown, someone else complained about rising electric bills. Parents coordinated carpool schedules. Teenagers whispered about crushes and homework. Elderly residents exchanged recipes. Nothing, absolutely nothing, pointed to the storm creeping toward their quiet existence. Still, here and there, subtle signs lingered. Barely noticeable, but present. Mrs. Halpern had mentioned to a friend that the birds near 46B had stopped nesting around the fig tree behind the old house. Too quiet, she had murmured, but her friend laughed it off, chalking it up to wildlife being unpredictable. The Ramos family's golden retriever, Sunny, had refused to walk past the abandoned property for almost 2 weeks, tugging the leash in the opposite direction every time they neared it. And young Lily had drawn a picture in chalk: a row of houses, a blue sky, and a dark, windowless shape at the end of the street. When her mother asked what the shape was, she hesitated. "I don't know," she said softly. "It feels like something's watching." But these were just tiny ripples in a lake that still seemed calm. Then came the final day of normalcy. Neighbors watered plants, children played tag, and teenagers scrolled through their phones on trampolines. No one noticed the faint tire marks near the entrance of the street, or the muddy footprints leading toward 46B, footprints too large to belong to any of the residents and too fresh to have been there earlier. That evening, porch lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the street in the same warm glow that had comforted them for years. Inside the Ramos home, the family shared dinner as Sunny lay quietly under the table, unusually tense. Across the street, Mr. Langley closed his curtains and prepared to watch his nightly news. And in the Halpern household, the elderly woman paused at her sink, sensing something she couldn't articulate. The wind felt colder. The street felt heavier. But she dismissed it. Everyone dismissed their small, fleeting anxieties. Because routine has a powerful way of convincing people that nothing bad could possibly come next. And that is why, when the stranger arrived in the middle of the night, it felt like reality itself had cracked open. Wycliffe Street had functioned on autopilot for so long that no one was prepared for the shock, the disruption, or the slow unraveling that was about to begin. Their peaceful bubble had been pierced, and none of them knew it yet, but the arrival of that unfamiliar figure had already begun rewriting their lives. By the next morning, the routines that once defined comfort began to shift. Dogs that were usually playful avoided their morning walks. Children who normally raced to the bus stop waited inside until the last possible minute. Adults glanced more frequently toward the end of the street, toward the house that had finally awakened after years of silence. Wycliffe Street had been frozen in routine. But now the ice had started to crack. And what lay beneath that familiar surface was something far darker than any of them were ready to face. In the days following the howling, people expected the new tenant of 46B to introduce himself, or at the very least, appear in daylight like any ordinary neighbor. But the stranger remained just that, a shadow moving behind half-closed curtains, a figure glimpsed only in the sliver between night and dawn. No one could recall seeing his face clearly. Some weren't even sure if they had seen him at all. His presence felt more like something sensed rather than witnessed. On the second morning, when the sun washed over Wycliffe Street in its usual soft gold, the dogs growled before the blinds were even opened. Their fur bristled as if they felt something humans couldn't. Sonny, the Ramos retriever, refused to step outside. The Keen's beagle barked relentlessly at the direction of 46B until its throat grew hoarse. Even the stray cats that lingered near the dumpsters migrated to the opposite end of the street. To the residents, this behavior didn't yet scream danger. Maybe the animals just needed time to adjust. But for anyone paying closer attention, it was clear that something about the new tenant tingled against instinct. From her front window, Mrs. Halpern watched with the same quiet suspicion she had honed over decades. She noticed the stranger's car, a dull gray sedan with a dented trunk, and the way it seemed to change spots throughout the day, despite no one seeing the man leave the house. She noticed how the blinds of 46B never fully opened, the interior swallowed in darkness even at noon. And she noticed, most of all, the basement window, the only one that seemed untouched by dust, glowing faintly at odd hours, like someone was working down there. Still, the street remained polite. No one wanted to seem nosy. After all, people moved to new neighborhoods all the time. Everyone had a right to privacy. But Wycliffe Street had never housed someone whose presence felt so heavy, so intrusive, even when he wasn't visible. One afternoon, the mailman, Curtis, attempted to deliver a small package addressed to the new resident. Normally cheerful, Curtis returned visibly pale. "Did you meet him?" Mr. Keen asked casually. Curtis swallowed hard. "No," he replied. But someone was standing behind the door. I could feel them, right there. They didn't open it. They didn't speak. They just stood. He shook his head. I don't know why, but it felt wrong. Word spread quietly. Not gossip, just concern disguised as curiosity. Later that evening, as the street bathed in the soft glow of porch lights, the first strange sound echoed from 46B. A slow, rhythmic scraping, metal against concrete. It drifted down the street like a chill, soft enough to question if it was real but persistent enough that several neighbors stepped outside pretending to check the mail or take out the trash. Each strained to hear it more clearly. The sound stopped whenever someone drew too close, as if the stranger inside sensed the attention. Children weren't allowed near the property anymore. Teenagers dared each other to walk past it at night, but even they moved quickly, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting a hand to reach out from the shadows. And then came the first glimpse. Not a proper sighting, just a fleeting moment. Mr. Langley, taking his trash out, saw a tall silhouette in the upstairs window, motionless, almost statuesque. The figure stood with its head slightly tilted, observing the street with unsettling stillness. When Mr. Langley blinked, the figure was gone. Inside the house, different residents experienced different things, yet all of them shared one detail: every encounter with the stranger was brief, unclear, and unsettling. The Keens saw him walking into his home one dusk, carrying a large, oddly shaped sack slung over his shoulder. The shape inside shifted, almost as if whatever was in it was still alive. They convinced themselves it was probably old furniture. They didn't want to imagine anything else. But the most disturbing incident came from someone who seldom spoke at all, Lily. One morning, she told her mother she had seen the tall man standing beside their fence at dawn. When asked what he looked like, she frowned. "I don't know," she said. "I can't remember his face. I only remember his smell." Her mother froze. "What smell?" Lily shrugged, trying to find the right words. "Like, wet dirt. And something metal." She made a face. "He talked funny too." This alarmed her mother. "You spoke to him?" A moment passed before Lily shook her head. "No, he spoke before I woke up." It didn't make sense, but the unease lodged itself deep in the mother's chest. As days passed, the stranger's peculiar habits began to stack into something that no longer felt explainable. His garbage bags were unusually heavy, but he left them loosely tied, revealing glimpses of dark stains inside. He never collected his mail. He tended to appear only in the periphery, figures seen from a distance, reflections caught in windows, footsteps heard at strange hours. And then came the scratching. Late one night, Mrs. Halpern awoke to a sound like nails dragging across concrete, slow, uneven, but deliberate. She followed the sound to her living room window. The noise was coming from the basement of 46B. She pressed her ear closer. Something, or someone, was inside that basement trying to claw upward. Her heart pounded. She reached for her phone to call someone, anyone, but the sound stopped. Silence returned, thick as fog. She told herself she imagined it. She had to believe she imagined it. But she didn't. Because she wasn't the only one who heard it. The next morning, while sweeping her porch, she caught movement near the basement window. A hand, pale, dirty, trembling, slipped back into the darkness. Not the hand of the stranger. Not an adult's hand at all. Something was alive beneath 46B. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And with that, the fear that had been creeping quietly through Wycliffe Street finally found a shape. By the time the fourth night arrived, the uneasy energy around 46B had seeped into every corner of Wycliffe Street. People tried to carry on with their lives, watering plants, eating dinner, watching late-night television, but everything felt slightly off balance, like the street itself had lost its natural rhythm. The dogs sensed it most. Their instincts had begun to override any training, any routine, any sense of comfort they once felt. They paced in circles, ears perked, eyes fixed on shadows no human could see. And when the sun finally dipped below the houses, the air turned heavy with a familiar dread. The first howl began just after midnight. One dog, thin and trembling, let out a long, wavering cry that echoed down the street. Moments later, another joined. Then another. And another. Soon the entire neighborhood was consumed by a chorus of desperate, hysterical howls that shook windows and rattled the nerves of everyone who heard them. It sounded nothing like the instinctive barking of territorial pets. It was more desperate. Like an alarm. A warning. A plea. Lights flicked on across the street. Residents hurried to their porches, whispering to one another, unsure if they should be scared or concerned or both. Children woke up crying. Teenagers sat frozen at their windows, phones forgotten in their hands. Even adults who usually brushed off neighborhood drama stood silently, stomachs twisting. And always, the dogs stared toward 46B. Sonny was the first to act. The golden retriever, always gentle and affectionate, suddenly tugged violently at his leash until it snapped clean off. He bolted toward the stranger's house, barking with a frantic urgency his owners had never heard from him. The Ramos family rushed outside, calling his name, but Sonny was gone, vanished behind the overgrown hedges of 46B before they could catch up. The street fell into stunned silence for a moment. Then the howling picked up again, louder than before. More distressed. More chaotic. Neighbors rushed back inside. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Around 12:25 a.m., the keen security camera picked up movement. A blurry, flickering silhouette moved across the far end of their yard, too tall to be a dog, too thin to be a person, and far too fast for anything natural. The figure paused near their fence, its shape distorted by the dim lighting. The camera struggled to focus on it, glitching every time the thing turned. The footage lasted only a few seconds before it abruptly cut out, but the final frame captured a shadow stretching far longer than any human body should. Mrs. Keene watched the recording twice, her hands shaking. Her husband watched it 3 times. Neither spoke at first. When they finally exchanged a look, fear settled between them like a silent agreement: they would tell no one, not yet. Not until they understood what they were seeing. Meanwhile, at the end of the street, the Langleys' German Shepherd pressed itself against their front door, growling in a deep, steady rumble. Its ears twitched toward the stranger's house. Then suddenly, without warning, it barked violently at the floor, the walls, the ceiling, as if something unseen was moving beneath or around the home. Mr. Langley tried to calm the animal, but the dog's fur bristled, teeth bared, eyes wide with a terror he couldn't begin to comprehend. And then, something changed. The howling, once wild and disorganized, began to sink. Slowly, unnervingly, the dog's cries aligned into a single collective rhythm. Every rise and fall happened at the same moment, each howl layered perfectly atop the other until the entire street vibrated with a chilling harmony that felt impossibly coordinated. It wasn't noise anymore. It was communication. Some residents covered their ears. Others simply froze, recognizing instinctively that something unnatural was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the synchronized howling broke apart into chaotic barking. Something had shifted. Something had moved. That was when the first scream echoed through the night. The Ramos family rushed outside to find Sonny, their beloved retriever, limping out from behind 46B. His fur was matted with dirt, his breathing ragged, and his eyes wide with an animal panic they had never seen before. He stumbled toward the family, tail tucked tightly under his body. They ran to him, relieved, but their relief dissolved into horror when they noticed the collar around his neck. It was soaked in blood. Not a smear, not a scratch, soaked. But not Sonny's blood. The dog had no wounds. Not a single cut, bite, or bruise. He trembled violently as Mrs. Ramos pressed her hands to his collar, trying to unfasten it. More blood dripped onto her fingers. She felt her heartbeat slam against her ribcage. Someone, or something, had gotten close enough to Sonny to mark him. But why wasn't he hurt? Whose blood was it? When they removed the collar, Sonny collapsed into their arms, whimpering. His eyes darted frantically toward 46B, and he began growling, not in aggression, but in fear. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering. Some urged the Ramos family to call the police. Others said it must have been a wild animal. But no one believed that. Not really. Because wild animals didn't make every dog howl in unison. Wild animals didn't turn security cameras into static. And wild animals didn't leave a dog drenched in someone else's blood without leaving a single mark on it. By 2 a.m., the howling had faded. The street was eerily silent again. Residents retreated into their homes, double-checking locks, closing curtains tighter than usual, whispering theories they didn't want to say out loud. At 46B, the lone window flickered with a faint, sickly light. The shape of the stranger moved past it, slow, deliberate, almost dragging one foot behind the other. And for a moment, the shadow paused near the window, as though sensing the attention of the frightened residents watching from afar. The dogs whimpered but didn't howl again. Whatever had happened that night, whatever had come out of or gone into the stranger's house, had left them utterly drained. And yet, despite all the fear, despite the blood, despite the impossible behavior of the animals, the worst had not yet happened. That terror would arrive soon. Because the night after the howling, someone on Wycliffe Street would disappear. And nothing would ever be the same again. The night after Sonny returned drenched in someone else's blood, an unsettling stillness settled over Wycliffe Street. No howling. No barking. No restless pacing. The dogs lay quietly, their bodies exhausted, their spirits strangely subdued. For the first time in days, residents thought they might finally get some sleep. But beneath the surface of that silence lurked something unnatural, something that felt like the world holding its breath before a storm. For Evan Miller, 14 years old and fiercely curious, that quiet felt suffocating. He was the kind of kid who found adventure in everything, old sheds, abandoned lots, empty fields, much to his mother's constant worry. And on this particular evening, that curiosity grew heavy inside him, pulling at his attention every time he glanced toward the dim silhouette of 46B. Something about the events of the previous nights had awakened an instinct in him. Not fear, yet. But the sense that something important was happening, something he needed to understand. Just after sunset, Evan clipped a leash onto his dog, Max, and stepped outside for what was supposed to be a routine walk. His mother called after him, asking him not to be long. She sounded tired, her nerves worn thin by the relentless anxiety gripping the street. Evan nodded, promising he would be back before dark completely settled. But he didn't return. The walk started normally enough. Evan let Max sniff along their usual path, kicking pebbles as he watched the sky turn from violet to deep blue. But Max kept stopping, lifting his head, ears twitching, staring at the end of the street where the stranger lived. Evan pulled gently on the leash, mumbling, "Come on, boy, not tonight." But Max resisted. His posture was rigid, fur raised along his spine. When Evan followed the dog's gaze, he saw it, the faint glow from the basement window of 46B. It shouldn't have been surprising, neighbors had noted that light for days now, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it flickered, dimmed, and then pulsed, as though something inside was moving in front of the bulb. Evan's breath caught. He took a step forward. A whisper of a thought surfaced, just a quick look. He knew he shouldn't. His mother had begged him to stay away. Everyone had. But curiosity tugged at him with a grip stronger than caution. Max whined. Not his usual anxious sound, this was sharper, urgent. But Evan reassured him with a few soft pats, whispering, "It's okay. We'll just look from the street." They walked toward 46B. Each step brought a thicker sensation of cold, as though the air changed the closer they came. The house, dark except for that faint basement glow, loomed like a restless shadow. Evan swallowed hard, trying to remember why this had seemed like a good idea. Then something scraped inside the house. A sudden, sharp sound. Metal. Concrete. Movement. Max began barking wildly, tugging away from the house, his nails scraping the pavement as he tried to pull Evan in the opposite direction. But Evan didn't let go of the leash. He took one more step forward. That was the last moment anyone saw him alive. What happened next remained a fractured story pieced together only through evidence and desperate guesswork. Max's leash was later found tangled around the old juniper bush by the driveway of 46B. The flashlight Evan carried was discovered in the street, its lens cracked, still faintly glowing. But Evan himself was gone. When he didn't return home within 10 minutes, his mother assumed he was lingering with friends. By 15 minutes, she texted him. By 20, she called, twice. No answer. After 30, she stepped outside, calling his name into the cooling night. The quiet that answered her sent a tremor through her. By the 40-minute mark, she was sprinting down the street, heart pounding, breath sharp, shouting for her son as panic flooded every corner of her mind. Neighbors joined in, emerging from their homes with flashlights, slipping on slippers and jackets, forming an impromptu search party. They fanned across Wycliffe Street, calling Evan's name, checking yards, bushes, porches, and garages. Fear spread quickly, thick, suffocating. Max was eventually found, trembling violently beside the old juniper plant. His leash was frayed, as if torn by force. Evan's mother collapsed to her knees beside the dog, clutching his fur, her shaking voice begging Max to somehow explain what had happened. But Max's eyes stayed fixed on 46B. Several neighbors approached the house, hesitating at the foot of the driveway. The windows were dark now, the basement light completely gone. The door stood closed, silent, unmoving. There was no sign of the stranger. No movement. No sound. Yet the air around the house felt charged, hostile. No one dared knock. It took less than an hour for the police to arrive. Officers taped off the area, asked questions, searched the route Evan usually took. They noted the flashlight, the leash, the torn strap. Every piece pointed toward the same chilling conclusion, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The search widened. Officers combed the street until dawn. Flashlights danced across trees, fences, storm drains, and thick hedges. Patrol cars drove slowly up and down the street, their radios crackling with updates that amounted to nothing. By morning, the neighborhood felt different. Something had changed on Wycliffe Street, something irreversible. Parents held their children closer. Curtains remained tightly shut. Dogs paced restlessly. And the quiet house at 46B, with its peeling paint and cold windows, seemed to stare back at the street like a watching predator. The stranger did not emerge that morning. No lights flicked on. No footsteps were heard. The house seemed to shrink into itself, sinking deeper into mystery. But the fear only grew. Detectives found one detail that shook them: Evan's flashlight had been discovered only a few feet from the edge of 46B's property, yet the beam had been pointing toward the house, not away from it. Whatever had frightened Evan, or drawn him closer, had come from that direction. Still, without evidence, they could not force entry. Rumors spread faster than fact. Some whispered that Evan had been lured. Others wondered if the stranger had been watching the boy for days. A few muttered that something was hiding inside the house, something not fully human. But the most terrifying speculation came from Lily, who said quietly, "He went to the house because he heard someone calling him." Her mother shushed her immediately, but the damage was done. Someone calling him. From 46B. By nightfall, the street was suffocating with fear. Porch lights stayed on. Parents barricaded doors. Dogs pressed against their owners' legs, refusing to leave their sight. Evan was not found that night. Nor the next. Nor the week after. And though the search expanded beyond the neighborhood, though flyers were printed and news crews interviewed residents with trembling voices, the truth lingered unspoken. Everyone on Wycliffe Street knew exactly where Evan had gone. The real question, the one that would haunt them for years, was what had taken him. And why the stranger at 46B had appeared just days before. By the time the sun climbed above Wycliffe Street the morning after Evan's disappearance, police cars lined the sidewalks like grim sentinels. Officers moved with urgency, their radios crackling with clipped updates. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, faces drawn, eyes swollen from sleeplessness. Everything about the street felt altered, its familiar warmth replaced by a cold tension that clung to every surface. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but they all knew, this was no ordinary missing person case. Detective Avery Caldwell arrived just after 7 a.m., her expression sharp yet tired, as if she had been pulled from a nightmare only to step into another. Avery had built her career on difficult cases, but she carried a private ghost, one unsolved disappearance from a town she'd worked in years before. A case that looked eerily similar to this one. She never spoke of it, but the failure lived inside her like a bruise that never healed. And now, standing at the edge of Wycliffe Street, she felt that old wound reopen. She began her assessment with methodical precision, walking slowly from house to house, studying the scene, observing the residents. Most avoided eye contact. A few burst into tears the moment she approached. And then there were the dogs, every one of them restless again, pacing, whining, refusing to look toward 46B. It unsettled Avery more than she cared to admit. By mid-morning, officers canvassed the area, knocking on doors, questioning residents about Evan's last movements. What they discovered was a patchwork of fear, speculation, and details that grew more disturbing with every retelling. Mrs. Ramos confirmed she had heard the dogs becoming agitated minutes before Evan's disappearance. Mr. Langley mentioned seeing a faint light from the basement window of 46B. Lily's mother hesitated but eventually admitted that her daughter had drawn the tall man, days earlier, a figure with no face, standing outside their fence. But the most alarming testimony came from the Keens, who finally shared their security footage. Detective Avery watched the distorted silhouette flicker across the screen, her jaw tightening. It didn't look like a person. It didn't move like one. And the fact that the camera malfunctioned each time the entity came into frame only deepened the unease settling in her chest. "We can't identify it," Mr. Keen whispered, not wanting the other neighbors to hear. "And I don't think we're supposed to." Avery didn't respond. But she replayed that footage at least 10 times before handing it to the digital forensics officers. Then came the moment everyone had dreaded. Avery approached 46B. No one had seen the stranger leave. No car had been spotted driving away. The house remained dark, quiet, sealed in its own suffocating stillness. The peeling paint and sagging shutters made it look abandoned, but the faint, rotten smell wafting from the cracks was very much alive. Avery stood at the door, listening. Inside, something creaked. Not footsteps, something heavier. Like a piece of furniture being dragged. Or something dragging itself. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. She signaled to the officers. "We need to take a look around the perimeter." They moved carefully, examining windows, the backyard, the overgrown plants encasing the property like a protective barrier. Avery crouched near the basement window and brushed her glove against the dirt beneath it. The soil had been disturbed, recently. Small scratches marked the frame, as though someone had tried desperately to pull it open from inside. Her pulse quickened. Inside the basement, she spotted something, just for a second. A figure. Barely visible in the dimness. It shifted toward the wall and then vanished before she could focus. She blinked, unsure if her eyes were tricking her or if something was truly moving in the shadows. She stood abruptly. "We need a warrant." But getting one wouldn't be easy. Without concrete evidence, without eyewitness testimony that directly implicated the resident, the judge hesitated. Hours passed. Precious hours. Hours that Avery felt slipping like sand through her fingers. Meanwhile, the street grew more anxious. Every neighbor had their own haunting memory of the past few days, and Avery noticed a clear pattern. Each story, each unease, each strange behavior of the animals, all pointed back to 46B. And yet, when she asked if anyone had actually seen the stranger up close, there was an unsettling consistency. No one could describe his face. Not his eyes. Not his hair. Not his build. Nothing. As if their minds had simply failed to remember. Or as if the stranger had never intended for them to. The warrant finally came through late afternoon. Officers gathered around the house, weapons drawn, not because they expected violence, but because no one could predict what was inside. Avery moved first, pushing open the front door with a slow creak that echoed through the hollow space. The air inside was thick, stale, almost suffocating. Dust coated every surface, yet the floor bore fresh tracks, footprints that led toward the basement door. A sickening odor drifted from below, metallic and sharp. Avery covered her mouth, exchanging a glance with the nearest officer. He looked pale. The basement door was locked. Avery inhaled deeply, bracing herself as officers forced it open. The door splintered. The smell intensified. They descended slowly, the beams of their flashlights slicing through the darkness. What they found was not illegal. But it was horrifying. Cages, empty, broken, clawed from the inside. Chains bolted into the concrete floor. Scratched walls. Stains that looked too dark to be rust. A mattress shifted against one corner, shredded like something had torn through it. And journals. Dozens of them. Avery picked one up with gloved hands. The pages were filled with erratic handwriting, scribbles overlapping, sentences trailing into nonsense, drawings that resembled animals, creatures with disfigured limbs, and eyes that looked far too human. One entry read, "They howl because they know. They always know before the others do." Another entry, "The basement is loud tonight. It wants out." Avery felt a chill that ran so deep it numbed her fingertips. But there was one detail that seized everyone's attention: fresh drag marks on the floor leading to the far corner of the basement, disappearing beneath a large wooden board. It looked like a makeshift trapdoor, scratched violently from below. Avery crouched, pressing her glove against the wood. It moved. Something beneath it shifted. Her breath caught. "Step back," she ordered quietly. Officers steadied themselves. Slowly, cautiously, they pried open the wooden board. Beneath it was a narrow shaft. Dirt walls. A tunnel descending into darkness. And inside that tunnel, a fingernail. A footprint. And a tiny scrap of fabric. Fabric that matched the shirt Evan had worn the night he disappeared. Avery closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the surge of dread in her chest. The tunnel was too narrow for an adult, but a child could have been dragged through it. And the claw marks, those jagged, desperate claw marks, covered nearly every inch of the earthen walls. But the stranger? Gone. As though he had vanished into the very darkness beneath his home. Avery stood, her voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. "We're not dealing with someone who wants to be found." Outside, neighbors watched anxiously as officers emerged from the house, faces pale and shaken. Word spread fast. And as fear rippled across Wycliffe Street, one truth settled heavy over every soul who lived there: the stranger had not just moved into 46B. He had brought something with him. And whatever it was still out there. Even with the tunnel discovered and evidence linking Evan's disappearance to the stranger's basement, investigators hesitated before descending into the darkness. The tunnel's mouth gaped like an open wound in the floor, the stale air rising from it thick with the smell of damp earth and something sharper, something metallic. Detective Avery felt her pulse spike as she stared into that pit. Every instinct inside her screamed that whatever lay below was worse than anything they had seen above. But she also knew that hesitation cost lives. She'd learned that the hard way in the case she had never solved. Still, before any officer could climb down, Avery ordered a full sweep of the house. If the stranger was still inside, hiding somewhere, they needed to know. They searched every room, every closet, every crawl space. But the house was empty, eerily empty. No clothes, no toiletries, no personal items. It was as if the resident had lived only in the basement, and had never intended to stay long. What they did find, however, only deepened the horror. In the kitchen, drawers were filled not with utensils, but with animal bones stripped clean. In a small bedroom, officers discovered a wall covered in pinned photographs, blurry, poorly lit, taken from odd angles. The subjects were the dogs of Wycliffe Street. Some photos were of them sleeping. Others captured them mid-howl. A few showed them staring directly at the camera with glowing, terrified eyes as if sensing someone standing inches away. Avery's stomach twisted. These weren't mementos. These were studies. Observations. Preparations. On the desk beneath the photos lay a single open notebook. The entry on the final page read, "They hear the truth before the rest. They see what hides behind the walls. They know the ones who do not belong." Avery shut the notebook with a shaky breath. The deeper they searched, the stranger the house became. In what should have been a storage room, officers found a stack of cages, large ones, medium ones, small ones, each stained and battered. Every cage door was bent outward, as though whatever had been inside had forced its way free with unnatural strength. The scratches inside each one were jagged, frantic. Something had fought violently to escape. But every cage was empty now. One officer muttered under his breath, "If these were animals, what kind of animal does this?" No one answered. Finally, with fear coiling in their bellies, they turned back to the tunnel. Avery descended first, gripping the rope ladder as the tunnel narrowed around her. The walls were close, too close, and she felt the claustrophobic pressure of the space with every breath. Her flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing claw marks carved deep into the dirt. Some were small, like a child's panicked scrapes. Others were far larger, deeper, shaped in a way that did not match any human hand. The further she climbed, the colder it became. The air thickened, heavy with moisture, but beneath it lingered another scent, one she recognized from autopsies. Decay. After several feet, she reached the bottom. Her boots sank slightly into the wet soil. The narrow tunnel extended forward, twisting like a burrowing creature had carved its way through the earth. Officers followed cautiously, their beams overlapping as they advanced step by tense step. The tunnel forked. 3 paths. All equally dark. All equally wrong. Avery chose the left, moving slowly, her breathing steady as she scanned the dirt for signs of Evan, footprints, fabric, anything. After several yards, her flashlight revealed something that made her freeze. Symbols. Carved into the dirt walls. Circles. Lines. Repeated patterns. Not random. Deliberate. Someone, or something, had carved these symbols everywhere. Hundreds of them. They formed spirals, grids, even shapes resembling eyes. Avery traced one with her gloved finger, feeling the grooves. It felt fresh. When they reached the end of the tunnel, the space widened into a crude underground chamber. The ceiling was low, the air heavy, but the chamber contained objects that made Avery's heart begin to race. Fabric scraps. Evan's shoe. A dog collar, Sonny's original one, torn at the buckle. And bones. So many bones. Some were animal. Some were not. A sharp cry caught the officer's attention. One of them had found something partially buried in the dirt. When they brushed the soil aside, they revealed what looked like a handful of fingernails, broken and bloodied. Avery swallowed hard. She recognized the color of the polish, deep blue. Evan's mother had painted her nails that color the night before he vanished. The reality struck like a physical blow. Evan had been here. He had fought. He had tried to climb out. But he hadn't succeeded. Avery forced herself to breathe. She could not afford to lose control. Not now. Another officer called out from the right tunnel. His voice trembled. "Detective, you need to see this." They retraced their way and followed the other path. 20 feet in, this tunnel widened into another chamber. This one was different, not chaotic like the first, but structured, organized. On the floor were dozens of candles melted into strange patterns. In the center sat a ring of stones surrounding a dark stain that looked like dried blood. And on the far wall, painted in smears of red and black, were drawings, twisted shapes representing animals, human silhouettes, and shadowy hybrid figures. Avery stared at the imagery. Some looked like they were worshipping something. Others looked like they were running from it. "What was he doing down here?" an officer whispered. Avery didn't answer. She didn't know. But then they found something that made the blood drain from every face in the chamber. A large crate sat against the wall. Chain marks wrapped around it, chains that had been ripped apart. The inside was shredded. And on the wood, carved deeply into the surface, were 5 words, "Do not follow it here." The implication rippled through them like a shockwave. It. Not him. Not the stranger. It. There was something else in these tunnels. Something the stranger either controlled, or feared. As they turned to leave the chamber, Avery's flashlight flickered across something in the corner, something small, something metallic. She walked toward it and crouched. It was a pendant, a small, silver dog tag. Engraved on it was a name. Max. Evan's dog had been dragged here too. Avery felt a chill deeper than fear. She didn't want to imagine why Max had been brought here. Or how he had escaped. Or why Sonny had returned covered in blood that wasn't his. When they returned to the main shaft and climbed out of the basement, daylight felt sickeningly bright, almost mocking. The neighbors watched with wide eyes as officers emerged pale, shaken. But the worst discovery was still to come. As they regrouped in the living room of 46B, Avery noticed a small door she hadn't checked yet, half hidden behind an old shelf. She approached it slowly. The door was barely large enough for a person to crawl through. She opened it. Inside was a narrow crawlspace. And at the back of that crawlspace, a fresh set of muddy footprints. The stranger's. Leading out the back of the house. Into the woods behind Wycliffe Street. He had vanished again. But he hadn't run away. He had gone somewhere with purpose. Because on the wall beside the crawlspace opening, written in dark, smeared strokes, was a final haunting message: "The dogs know I'm not the only one." And in that moment, Avery understood something chilling: whatever had taken Evan, was not just the stranger. Something else was lurking beneath Wycliffe Street. Something older. Something hungry. And it wasn't finished yet. Detective Avery didn't sleep the night they searched the tunnels under 46B. She sat in the temporary command post set up in the community center, surrounded by maps, photographs, soil samples, shredded fabric pieces, and the journals recovered from the basement. Every page she turned made her feel as though she was sinking deeper into a story that had no logical beginning, and no clear end. One thing was obvious: the stranger at 46B hadn't simply appeared on Wycliffe Street by chance. He had a pattern, a history, a trail that stretched far beyond the boundaries of this neighborhood. And Avery needed to uncover it before something else happened. The journals weren't dated, but the drawings and references, cryptic symbols, mentions of disappearances, strange note-like observations, hinted at movement from one town to another. Avery zoomed into the photographs she'd taken of the pages. In the margins of one entry were the words, "Second town. 2 taken. Dogs warned first." Another page read, "The place with red barns. The howling lasted 3 nights. They called me a curse." Avery's stomach twisted. These weren't hallucinations of a disturbed man. These were records. She spread out a map, marking towns within a 200-mile radius. Then she assigned analysts to pull all missing person cases from the last 15 years involving unexplained animal behavior or sudden pet disappearances. It took hours, but by dawn, a pattern emerged. 3 small towns. 4 rural communities. 1 suburb eerily similar to Wycliffe Street. In every place the stranger had lived, at least one person had vanished. In some towns, more. And each location reported the same disturbing detail: an unusual spike in animal distress, dogs howling without cause, pets running away, livestock acting erratically. The deeper she dug, the more horrifying it became. One report from a town called Brookhaven described a night where, the dogs did not stop howling until sunrise, followed by the disappearance of a 9-year-old boy. Another town, Red Creek, had reported burrows found beneath several homes, though no culprit had ever been identified. The stranger had been there too. Same alias. Same car. Same behavior, moving in silently, staying reclusive, leaving abruptly. Avery leaned back in her chair, rubbing her forehead. Everything in her training told her this was human: kidnapping, psychological issues, trauma-driven violence. But nothing about this pattern felt purely human. Not the tunnels. Not the synchronized animal reactions. Not the symbols carved in earth as if something far older than the stranger had taught him. She exhaled shakily. What were you running from, or running toward? She assigned a team to check property records across all listed towns. Hours later, a chilling connection surfaced: every house the stranger had moved into had a history of tragedy. Fires. Suicides. Missing children. Violent crimes that locals barely remembered because the towns themselves had gradually allowed the memories to fade. As if someone, or something, wanted them forgotten. But why choose these houses? Why these streets? Why the dogs? Avery's eyes drifted over the photographs of 46B. She stared at the basement tunnel entrance, at the symbols, at the blood-stained stone circle. And suddenly it clicked. What if he wasn't the beginning, she whispered. What if he was only the result, the carrier, the witness? The stranger hadn't started the darkness. He had brought it with him, because it had already claimed him. Late that night, Avery drove to the nearest archived newspaper library. The digital databases had gaps, too many gaps to ignore, so she needed to go to the physical records. Dust-covered cabinets. Grainy microfilm. Forgotten obituaries. She sifted through old reports until her eyes burned. Then she found it. A photograph. Old, grainy, but unmistakable. A house, different town, different state, but identical layout to 46B. Same window placement. Same crawlspace design. And in front of it, a headline: Murder-Suicide in Former Boarding Home. Survivors claim, scratching in walls. The article detailed a family that had moved into the abandoned property only to flee weeks later, claiming they heard something moving inside the walls. When authorities investigated, they found tunnels beneath the house, very similar to those under 46B. But the detail that froze Avery was the date, 1953. The stranger hadn't been alive then. So how had he ended up following a chain of houses spanning decades? She flipped the page. Another article, decades later, referenced the same house. This time, animal disappearances. Then a missing teenager. Then a different resident, described as reclusive, erratic, rarely seen. The pattern repeated itself like a curse, moving from one host to the next. Had the stranger become one of these hosts? Or had he been chosen? Avery returned to Wycliffe Street with her mind racing. She walked toward 46B, the house looming against the night sky like a waiting predator. Something about the property felt alive, as if it were breathing, expanding, listening. She stopped at the old fig tree behind the yard, the one that birds had abandoned months earlier. The ground beneath it was uneven, loose, disturbed. She crouched, brushing away leaves. More claw marks. Fresh ones. Something had dug its way out. Not in. Just then, Officer Gray approached, panting slightly from running. "Detective, there's something you need to see." He handed her a manila folder. Inside were old census records, property deeds, and statements from previous owners of similar houses. One homeowner, 50 years ago, had written a line that chilled her to her core: the thing in the basement chose our house because something was already waiting beneath it. Avery felt the blood drain from her face. 46B wasn't cursed because the stranger lived there. The stranger lived there because the house itself was cursed long before him. Something ancient. Something buried. Something that moved from home to home, from family to family, from host to host. And if the patterns were correct, whatever lived beneath 46B was growing stronger. It was no longer content with animals. It was taking children. Just as Avery closed the folder, a sudden sound echoed from the woods behind the street, a sharp, splintering snap of branches. Flashlights turned. Officers drew weapons. A shadow shifted between the trees. Tall. Thin. Moving with an unnatural grace that made Avery's breath catch. It wasn't the stranger. It was something else. Something larger. Something watching the neighborhood with unblinking hunger. The dogs began to howl again. Softly at first. Then louder. Then in perfect unison. And Avery understood, with a cold certainty that hollowed her out, Evan was only the beginning. Whatever had been hiding beneath Wycliffe Street was no longer hiding. It was hunting. The following morning, Wycliffe Street felt as though it were holding its breath. The howling the night before had lasted nearly an hour, long enough for every resident to understand that whatever was lurking in the woods was inching closer. Dogs refused to step outside. Children were kept indoors. Adults walked with lowered voices and heightened alertness, casting glances toward the tree line every few minutes. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was the dawning realization that something had claimed their neighborhood. Detective Avery arrived early, her mind heavy with the research she'd unearthed the night before. As she stepped out of her car, an officer jogged toward her, clutching a box caked in dust and cobwebs. "Ma'am," he said breathlessly, "you need to see this." The box had been discovered in the far corner of 46B's attic behind a wall panel so tightly wedged it had likely been untouched for years. Avery knelt beside it, brushing off layers of grime until faint handwriting became visible on the lid. "Tapes, do not play alone." Her fingers hesitated before opening the box. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes, each unlabeled except for a number scrawled in black marker, 1 through 42. Some were warped, others cracked. A few still had dirt on them, as if they had once been buried. Avery's pulse quickened. She signaled for the media team to set up equipment in the command center. As the first tape clicked into the player, a static hiss filled the room, sharp enough to make one officer flinch. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic breathing. Not human breathing. Something heavier. Something wet. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. And then a voice whispered softly in the background. A child's voice. Avery leaned forward, heart pounding. "Hello." The voice was trembling. "Is someone there?" Officers stiffened. The tape had been recorded in near total darkness, the audio filled with faint shuffling, the scraping of nails against stone, and the distant sound of dripping water. Then another voice appeared, older, distorted, as though filtered through layers of static. "You should not talk. It listens." A chill crawled through Avery's chest. She had heard countless disturbing tapes in her career, but nothing had ever felt this wrong. On tape 3, the sound quality worsened. What began as faint animal whimpers grew into frantic scratching, no, clawing, against what sounded like wood. The scraping filled the speakers, growing louder, more desperate, until it suddenly stopped. Then there was silence for nearly 20 seconds. Followed by a sound no one expected. A growl. Not an animal's growl. Something deeper. Something guttural. Something ancient. Even distorted through poor audio, it made the room fall completely silent. Tape 7 brought something even more disturbing. A melodic tone, soft, rhythmic, like chanting. Multiple voices, layered over each other, whispering in a language no one recognized. The chanting grew louder, rising in pace, intensity, urgency, until it abruptly cut off with a sharp gasp, as though someone had been yanked away mid-breath. Tape 11 changed everything. The tape began with shuffling and faint breathing again, this time clearly human. A man's voice whispered shakily, "I can hear it beneath the floor again. It's moving." A scrape followed. A thud. And then a sound like hands slamming against a wooden board. "It's hungry tonight," the man whispered. "The dogs won't stop warning me. They always know first." More scratching. More pounding. As though something inside the house, inside the walls, was trying to dig its way through. Then suddenly, the recording shifted. A faint cry echoed through the speakers. "Help, please." Avery's blood turned cold. The voice was unmistakably that of a young boy. Tape 16 contained the first clear recording of the stranger. His voice was low, strained, as though he were speaking through clenched teeth. "It followed me from Brookhaven." Static swallowed some of his words. "It finds the sick houses. The broken ones. The old ones with tunnels beneath. It waits. It digs. It listens." Another burst of static. "I tried to trap it. I tried." A loud crash drowned out the rest, followed by the man's scream. Tape 19 offered the first piece of information about Evan. The tape began with faint sobbing. "Not the stranger's. A child's. My name is Evan Miller." Officers froze. Avery's breath caught in her throat. Evan's voice trembled as he tried to speak through choked sobs. "I don't know where I am. I think I'm underground. It's cold. There's dirt everywhere. Max was here but he ran. It got close to him." A scraping sound. A thump. Then silence. Evan whispered, "Please help me. If someone finds this, please get my mom." "I don't want to," a low growl interrupted him. A long, rumbling growl that made the speakers rattle. Evan whimpered. "It's above me." Then the tape ended abruptly. A tremor ran through the command center. Officers looked anywhere but at each other, as though acknowledging what they had heard would make it real. Some turned away, swallowing hard. A few quietly stepped outside just to breathe. But the worst was still waiting. Tape 23. It began with chaotic movement, running footsteps, crashing debris, frantic breathing. The stranger's voice shouted, "Get back. Stay back." Something heavy slammed into wood again and again, trying to break through. Then the stranger spoke directly into the recorder, his voice trembling. "I can't stop it. It's not an animal. It's not a person. It's not anything I've ever." A roar, deep, monstrous, layered with tones no creature should possess, cut off his words. A sickening crunch followed. Then silence. Tape 31 contained no voices at all, only a strange rhythmic thudding beneath what sounded like stone. It echoed like a heartbeat. Slow. Heavy. Ancient. But it was tape 37 that destroyed what little hope remained. The recording began quietly, almost peacefully. For the first 30 seconds, there was nothing but dripping water. Then, faintly, a voice emerged. Evan's voice. Alive. But wrong. His tone was flat, hollow, emotionless. As though repeating words someone else had forced into his mouth. "It's coming into the houses now." A long pause. It learned how to follow the light. A scraping sound. A deep inhale. A whisper. "It's hungry." The tape ended. No one moved for several seconds after it stopped playing. The silence that followed felt suffocating, pressing against everyone in the room. Avery stared at the radio, her knuckles white. "What do you think happened to him?" an officer whispered. Avery didn't answer. Because she didn't know. What she did know, what she felt deep in her chest like a truth carved into bone, was that something beneath Wycliffe Street was getting closer. Smarter. More brazen. And if Evan's voice on tape 37 was truly real, then he hadn't died quickly. He had been changed. Taken. Consumed. Repurposed. Avery shut off the recorder and stood, trying to steady her breathing. "We need eyes in the woods," she said quietly. "Tonight. No matter what. Because whatever hid beneath 46B had moved. And the dogs had already sensed it. The howling would begin again. But next time, it wouldn't be a warning. It would be a cry too late to save anyone." Fog rolled across Wycliffe Street like a living thing, swallowing porches, mailboxes, and the trembling silhouettes of dogs frozen in their yards. Detective Avery felt the shift before anyone spoke, an instinctive tightening in the air, a pressure that made her heart beat slow and heavy. Officers scanned the tree line, flashlights trembling slightly in their hands. Everyone sensed it. He was back. At 1:14 a.m., a motion sensor tripped behind 46B. The feed crackled to life, showing a tall, thin figure emerging from the edge of the woods. His movements were uneven, dragging, as if his body no longer remembered how to be human. Mud coated his clothing. His head hung at an unnatural angle. And though the image was grainy, one detail stood out with horrifying clarity: his hands were covered in dirt. Fresh dirt. Avery moved closer, whispering, "Don't lose him." Officers spread out, forming a perimeter, though none felt confident they could stop whatever he'd become. The stranger paused at the back door of 46B, placing his palm flat against the wood. For a moment, the entire house seemed to breathe with him, its windows pulsing faintly as though responding. Then he turned. His eyes, sunken, glassy, unfocused, looked directly at Avery. Recognition flickered, but something else lived behind his gaze, something hollow and ancient. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a strained rasp escaped. Too late. Before Avery could move, a violent shudder passed through the ground beneath them. Dogs erupted into frantic howling. The stranger stepped backward into the dark, merging with the shadows as though pulled by invisible hands. And from beneath 46 came a sound Avery had dreaded since the first day she arrived, a low, rising growl. Not his. Something bigger.